Hawane GPJ Lulu, Fatulu, a Santi, Tibija Balu, Tijabalo. Is it Lama Tijaba Suraga, Kunanga, Toko Puravano, Kunanga, Nanga Yu de Gego. Sina Babana, say when she did along, didn't the no? Along by this was
the distinguished representative of the Philippines. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Pakistan.
Mr. President, we thank Special Envoy Ms. Julie Bishop for the briefing and acknowledge her work to promote dialogue and national reconciliation in Myanmar. Pakistan supports efforts aimed at fostering peace, stability, and national reconciliation in Myanmar. Mr. President, the plight of Rohingya remains a pressing humanitarian and human rights concern. Years of displacement, uncertainty, and restricted access to fundamental rights and essential services have left hundreds and thousands in a situation of prolonged vulnerability. The continued instability in Rakhine State has led to aggravated humanitarian needs and underscores the need of sustained international attention. Pakistan believes that the complexity of the situations call for a balanced, constructive, and forward-looking approach. Efforts to address humanitarian needs and advance durable solutions should be guided by dialogue, cooperation, and shared responsibility while fully respecting Myanmar's sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity. As a country that has hosted millions of refugees over decades, Pakistan appreciates the significant burden borne by host communities in sheltering Rohingya Muslims and recognizes the importance of international solidarity and burden sharing. A lasting solution requires addressing the root causes of the crisis. In this regard, the recommendations of the Advisory Commission on Rakhine State, particularly those related to citizenship, inclusion, and equal rights, remain relevant in creating conditions conducive to the safe, voluntary, dignified, and sustainable return of displaced Rohingyas. Mr. President, we stand ready to work with the United Nations, ASEAN, the OIC, and all partners to enable the Rohingya to return to their homeland in safety and dignity. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Pakistan. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation. Mr. President, the Russian Federation has stood staunchly against the practice of adopting selective unilateral resolutions on the human rights situations of specific countries. We deem this working method to be ineffective, nor does it further the defense of human rights. On the contrary, such steps only serve to heighten the confrontation between states. This is why we did not endorse Resolution 80/221, adopted by the UN General Assembly in December of 2025. We've underlined on numerous occasions that the situation in Myanmar does not pose a threat to international peace and security. The roots of Myanmar's internal problems stretch deep into its colonial past. We welcome the general parliamentary elections that were held with a participation rate of 90% of citizens. 90% of citizens residing across 80% of Myanmar's territory. The absence of irregularities has, inter alia, been confirmed by international observers. Out of the 57 political parties who participated, several dozen won seats in the national parliament. This gives us grounds for asserting with a degree of certainty that both the elections and the new government of Myanmar are legitimate. The country's predictable development within the bounds of the law is now secure for the medium term. We draw your attention to Naypyidaw's efforts to resume dialogue with armed ethnic groups, as well as to intensify the constitutional reform process. We welcome the amnesty of over 25,000 people, including the former president, Win Myint, as well as the transfer to house arrest of the former state councillor, Aung San Suu Kyi. The members of the opposition of the so-called People's Defense Force who voluntarily laid down their arms have been exempted from criminal prosecution, nor are any disciplinary measures being imposed on former members of the so-called civil disobedience movement. We note the greater government control in the northeast of the country, where a series of state institutions have resumed their activities. The authorities' efforts to counter transnational crime, to shut down cybercrime centers, as well as labs producing drugs, deserve our attention. The main destabilizing factor is the armed opposition, led by the self-appointed so-called National Unity Government. It is continuing to wage terror against ordinary citizens and bears responsibility for the deaths of over 9,000 people. Financial and logistical support from abroad to this organization does nothing but fuel terrorist activity. We note with regret the destructive actions taken by the militia group, the Arakan Army, in the Rakhine State. These have negative consequences for the speaker's microphone has been cut off. I thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Malaysia.
President, Malaysia thanks the Special Envoy for her briefing and for her continued efforts towards finding a peaceful and inclusive resolution to the situation in Myanmar. Malaysia is particularly concerned that notwithstanding the recently concluded electoral exercise, violence across Myanmar continues unabated and in many areas has intensified. Reports of ongoing armed confrontations, aerial attacks, civilian casualties, displacement and restrictions on humanitarian access has worsened the suffering of the people, especially women and children. The deteriorating conditions have had a particularly severe impact on vulnerable and minority communities, especially the Rohingya. They continue to face discrimination and limited access to basic necessities, including food, shelter, and access to healthcare. This not only exacerbate their humanitarian plight, but also undermine the prospects for the voluntary, safe, dignified, and sustainable return of displaced Rohingya to their places of origin. Malaysia recognizes Bangladesh's undertaking in hosting Rohingya refugees in substantial number. As a country also hosting a significant Rohingya refugee population, Malaysia continues to witness the regional consequences of the crisis. We reiterate that the root causes of the Rohingya situation, including issues relating to citizenship, rights, security, and inclusion, must be addressed comprehensively. Lasting peace and stability cannot be achieved without ensuring the protection and dignity of our communities, including the Rohingya. ASEAN's 5-point consensus remains the primary framework for Malaysia's engagements with all parties in Myanmar, particularly on the cessation of violence, protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure, inclusive dialogue among all stakeholders, and the provision of safe and unhindered humanitarian assistance. We call for unhindered and sustained humanitarian access to all affected populations without discrimination and in accordance with international law. All parties must refrain from actions that endanger civilians or obstruct humanitarian relief efforts. Malaysia reaffirms its full support to the Special Envoy in discharging her mandate and encourages sustained international attention to the situation. Any durable solution must be anchored in an immediate cessation of violence, meaningful and inclusive political dialogue, and the full participation of all stakeholders. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Malaysia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Australia.
Thank you, President, and thank you very much indeed, Special Envoy, for your briefing and how sobering it is to recall that today is Daw Aung San Suu Kyi's birthday. Your work, Special Envoy, is absolutely vital in keeping global attention on the Myanmar issue, and the situation you've described is really extremely concerning. We all know that it's some 5 years since the military overthrew the democratically elected government, and it's clear that violence is persisting at scale and inflicting immense suffering on the people of Myanmar and spreading instability across the region. Recent elections were not free, not fair, nor were they inclusive. Despite reports of recent prisoner amnesties, thousands remained unjustly detained, and we call for their full and unconditional release. And of course, this includes Daw Aung San Suu Kyi, who must be afforded appropriate medical care, contact with her family, and access to her lawyers. Today, I've got 4 points to make. First, the violence must end. Australia remains deeply concerned by continued attacks on civilians, human rights violations and abuses, sexual and gender-based violence, and discrimination against minorities, and will continue to judge the authorities by their actions. Second, humanitarian needs must be addressed. The humanitarian situation is clearly dire, with over 16 million people in need of assistance and nearly 4 million people internally displaced. The crisis has exacerbated transnational crime, including online scam centres, drug production and human trafficking, and we know the consequences of this both internally and internationally. Australia is taking action. We committed some $370 million in a humanitarian package in 2026, and over 3 years we've committed some 1.26 billion Australian dollars since 2017. The package will address the rapidly escalating humanitarian crisis, including support for 1 million Rohingya in Bangladesh. Third, we must not lose sight of accountability. We remain deeply concerned about the situation in Rakhine State and the plight of displaced Rohingya, and we maintain our support for international efforts to pursue accountability. Finally, regional leadership is essential. We reiterate our strong support for ASEAN's central role and the 5-point consensus being implemented in full. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Australia and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of China.
President, I've listened attentively to the briefing by Special Envoy Bishop. On human rights, China has consistently advocated for exchanges and cooperation based on equality and mutual respect. We reject attempts to politicize or instrumentalize human rights or apply double standards. We oppose the use of human rights as a pretext to interfere in the internal affairs of other countries. Since the conclusion of general elections earlier this year, the new government has assumed office smoothly and has been making all-out efforts to promote national peace and development. As a friendly neighbor, China firmly supports Myanmar in pursuing a development path that accords with its national conditions and enjoys the support of its people, safeguarding its national sovereignty, security, territorial integrity, and national dignity, and achieving peace and stability, national reconciliation, social harmony, as well as lasting stability. Myanmar is an important member of the ASEAN family and an equal member of the international community. China supports Myanmar's full, equal, and constructive participation in ASEAN and UN mechanisms and processes, bearing in mind the country's legitimate rights and interests. We support a greater role of ASEAN on the Myanmar issue in the ASEAN way. The international community should work in concert with ASEAN and regional countries, strengthen constructive engagement with Myanmar, and foster a conducive environment to maintain the current positive momentum. China hopes that Special Envoy Bishop will continue to play a constructive role in this regard. For the people of Myanmar, economic recovery and better livelihoods are among their most ardent aspirations. China actively supports Myanmar's post-earthquake reconstruction and broader economic and social development, and stands ready to provide more assistance within its capabilities. We hope that the international community will sustain its support and help Myanmar achieve lasting stability, development, and rejuvenation at an early date. China has been following closely the situation of the people displaced from Rakhine State. We commend the government of Bangladesh for the generous assistance it has provided over the years to the displaced communities. The return of those peoples should ultimately be addressed gradually through dialogue and consultation between Myanmar and Bangladesh. China has played an active role throughout this process, delivering multiple shipments of humanitarian aid to both sides and facilitating important consensus on several issues. The international community should exercise similar patience, support stronger engagement between the two countries, and facilitate repatriation by creating favorable conditions and a conducive environment. Thank you, President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the People's Republic of China. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President, and thank you, Special Envoy Julie Bishop, for your sobering briefing, including details of your latest visit to Naypyidaw. Colleagues, the United Kingdom remains deeply concerned by the continued and deepening violence across Myanmar. Today, on the 81st birthday of Aung San Suu Kyi, her detention is a sad reminder of all those imprisoned during the ongoing fight for democratic rights. As you have described, the military campaign of violence against civilians is relentless. This includes escalating airstrikes, the destruction of homes, schools, places of worship, and medical facilities, as well as forced conscription, arbitrary detention, and restrictions on humanitarian access. This is unacceptable and only puts a stable future further out of reach. 16.2 million people, including 5 million children, require life-saving assistance and protection. And yet, access restrictions continue to limit delivery, increasing the risk of food insecurity and exacerbating risks to vulnerable communities, including the Rohingya. Colleagues, let me be clear, there could be no credible path to peace whilst violence continues, political prisoners remain detained, and inclusive dialogue is absent. Reports of Aung San Suu Kyi's purported transfer to house arrest falls far short of the full and unconditional release called by the international community. In this context, we believe it is critical for all of us to predicate any engagement with the military authorities on demonstrable commitment to delivery of the 5-point consensus. Without this, there is a real risk that our shared priorities, ending violence, unrestricted humanitarian access, and advancement of genuinely inclusive dialogue, will continue to be disregarded by the military. They will take what we offer in the hope of progress without feeling the pressure to change their approach. As penholder in the Security Council, the United Kingdom remains committed to keeping Myanmar on the international agenda and working together with the UN, ASEAN, and other partners towards our shared goal of a stable, peaceful, and democratic Myanmar. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Norway.
Thank you very much, President, and thank you very much, Special Envoy, for your important update and for your good offices. Norway shares your concern about the continued multidimensional crisis in Myanmar. And following the military-organized elections, we have yet to see clear actions aimed at reducing violence against civilians or fostering a more inclusive political process. The human toll of this conflict, including for women and children, and the regression in development and human rights, is frankly devastating. And as you pointed out, this crisis also reflects the region, threatening stability and development. So, President, we reiterate our call on all actors to do everything they can to put an end to the violations and abuses and chart a different trajectory. In line with UN Security Council Resolution 2669 and ASEAN's 5-point consensus, we urge all conflict parties to respect their obligations under international humanitarian law. We call for safe, rapid and unimpeded humanitarian access and encourage others to join the funding efforts. We continue to support efforts to promote genuine, constructive and inclusive dialogue, including of women and youth. These are necessary steps to address root causes and identify possible paths towards more inclusive and sustainable solutions. Regional actors hold leverage and have a key role to play. We welcome continued collaboration between yourself and the ASEAN Special Envoys, and we encourage the international community to maintain strong support for your efforts, Special Envoy. And if I may ask a question, where do you see areas of common interest where the international community could focus their engagement on Myanmar? Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Norway, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Latvia.
Mr. President, Madam Special Envoy, Latvia aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union. We welcome the briefing and fully support the work of the Special Envoy. At the outset, Latvia wished to acknowledge and commend the generosity of Bangladesh for hosting over 1 million Rohingya refugees. Mr. President, our goal is clear: the voluntary, safe, dignified, and sustainable return of refugees and internally displaced persons to their homes. To create the conditions for achieving this goal, Latvia, as a member of the Security Council, calls for the full implementation of the Council's Resolution 2669, which includes an immediate end to violence, full and unhindered humanitarian access, the protections of civilians under international humanitarian law, and the full, equal and meaningful participation of women in peace processes. Credible reports indicate widespread violations of international human rights and humanitarian law. It must be underlined that international humanitarian law demands that hospitals, schools and places of worship are not targeted. It calls for concrete measures to mitigate harm to civilians. It also mandates full, safe, and unimpeded humanitarian access. These are not suggestions, they are obligations. In this regard, we commend the work of the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar, the International Court of Justice, and the International Criminal Court in advancing justice and accountability. We wish to emphasize the inclusion of women in peace-building processes. Women and girls have suffered immensely in this conflict, as they do in all conflicts, yet they are also powerful agents of change. We call for women's leadership in all negotiations. Mr. President, if the violence stops and humanitarian access is granted, food supply chains can stabilize, health services can resume, and children can return to learning. These are the foundational conditions for achieving our shared goal, the voluntary, safe, dignified, and sustainable return of refugees and internally displaced persons to their homes. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Latvia. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Indonesia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to commend Special Envoy Bishop for her comprehensive update, as well as the continued efforts on this pertinent issue and her close coordination with ASEAN. Indonesia remains deeply concerned about the ongoing conflict and the worsening humanitarian situations. We reiterate the urgent need to halt all violence against civilians and civilian infrastructure. On the situations of the Rohingya, we underscore the importance of safe, dignified, and voluntary repatriations of all forcibly displaced persons guided by the preliminary needs assessment. We call on all parties to cease hostilities and exercise maximum restraint to create conditions conducive to an inclusive national dialogue. Indonesia reaffirms its commitment to advancing the ASEAN's 5-point consensus as the framework for a peaceful, durable, Myanmar-owned and Myanmar-led solutions. We further urge all relevant parties to guarantee safe, transparent, inclusive, and non-discriminatory humanitarian access. We encourage sustained international financial support for these essential efforts. Indonesia takes note of the recent release of prisoners and calls for more constructive steps toward fostering inclusive political dialogue. We stress the importance of engaging all stakeholders to maintain open channels of communications, including on matters related to the Rohingya. Indonesia will continue to play an active and constructive role and stands ready to extend any assistance to ensure the cessation of violence and inclusive national dialogue. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Indonesia. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of India.
Thank you, Mr. President. We have heard the statement by the UN Secretary General Special Envoy on Myanmar, Her Excellency Ms. Julie Bishop, very carefully. We support the efforts of UNSG Special Envoy and continue to work closely with ASEAN under the 5-point framework consensus. An immediate neighbors sharing over 1,600 kilometers of land border with Myanmar, our affinity for our friendly people of Myanmar is natural. Our two countries share deep-seated civilizational, religious, and people-to-people ties. We continue to accord the highest priority to restoration of peace and stability in the country. India remains committed to supporting Myanmar's transition towards inclusive and federal democracy and continues to underline that the solution has to be Myanmar-led and Myanmar-owned. We note the deteriorating humanitarian and security situation in Myanmar and have consistently called for immediate cessation of violence, release of political detainees, provision of humanitarian assistance, and return to normalcy. We remain concerned over the impact of this situation along our shared border in the form of influx of thousands of persons into our northeastern states, as well as the increase in transnational narcotic crimes, cyber crimes, and human trafficking. Myanmar President Min Aung Hlaing had recently visited India. It was an opportunity for the Indian leadership to impress upon him the importance of these concerns, as well as have a discussion on security-related issues, border management, development assistance, trade and commerce, and fostering people-to-people exchanges. India's Prime Minister conveyed support for Myanmar-led efforts towards achieving peace, stability, national reconciliation, and social development. We also offered continued assistance and cooperation based on mutual respect and friendly relations between the two countries. The ongoing fighting has led to more than 80,000 Myanmar nationals taking shelter in India. India will stay steadfast in prioritizing people-centric initiatives as a neighbor and development partner of Myanmar. We encourage the international community to work together to support the people of Myanmar and facilitate a return to peace. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of India and I give the floor to la parole au distingué représentant du Vietnam.
I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Vietnam.
Mr. President, I thank you for convening this meeting and thank Special Envoy Julie Bishop for her briefing. We commend her efforts and steadfast commitment to addressing the crisis in Myanmar. Vietnam has been closely following the developments in Myanmar and taking note of positive steps in Myanmar toward peace, security, stability, and national reconciliation, and hope that such measures will be further sustained and expanded. At the same time, we reiterate our call for the full and effective implementation of the ASEAN 5-point consensus. We urge all parties concerned to exercise maximum restraints and all forms of violence, protect civilian and civilian infrastructure, and engage in meaningful dialogue toward resolution that reflects the will and interests of the people of Myanmar. Dialogue, not confrontation, remains the only viable path to a peaceful, comprehensive, and sustainable solution. Humanitarian assistance must reach all those in need safely, timely, and without discrimination. We support the continued role of the AHA Center and coordination with relevant UN agencies and humanitarian actors on the ground. The situation in Rakhine State remains of serious concern. It is vital to provide life-saving assistance to vulnerable groups, including internally displaced persons, and to promote conditions conducive to safe, voluntary, dignified, and sustainable returns. We commend the Philippines as ASEAN Chair and the ASEAN Chair's Special Envoy for advancing ASEAN's engagement. Vietnam supports close coordination between ASEAN and the UN, including between their respective special envoys, while respecting Myanmar's sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity, and national unity. Vietnam reaffirms its strong commitment to contribute to peace and stability in Southeast Asia, including in Myanmar. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Vietnam. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Liechtenstein.
Thank you, President, and we thank the Special Envoy for her briefing. The situation in Myanmar remains a political, security and human rights crisis. Since the military coup, the junta has continued its violent oppression of dissent while facing growing armed resistance across large parts of the country, deepening the suffering of the people of Myanmar. The conflict has exacted a catastrophic humanitarian toll, with millions displaced and in need of assistance. Liechtenstein does not recognize the junta's attempt to hold so-called elections beginning late last year, intended to create a pretext for legitimacy and crafted in a way that prevented the free exercise of democracy. We encourage all of Myanmar's partners not to recognize the elections nor its claimed results. We welcome the recent release of President Win Myint, as called for in Resolution 75/287. Note the reported, while unverified, easing of restrictions on State Councillor Aung San Suu Kyi. These developments are encouraging, but they do not change the need for an inclusive political solution in accordance with the will of the people of Myanmar. Since the Security Council adopted its Resolution 2669 in 2022, implementation has been lacking and the situation has continued to deteriorate. Further Council action, including on the ending of arms transfers as called for by the General Assembly, has been constrained by divisions among permanent members and the threat of vetoes, which is a call also on the General Assembly consider taking action of its own again. Mr. President, impunity for serious international crimes has fueled further violence. The Security Council should refer the situation in Myanmar to the ICC, which has an active, while only partial, investigation, and support compliance with the provisional measures ordered by the International Court of Justice. We also fully support the ongoing work of the independent investigative mechanism for Myanmar. Mr. President, we reiterate calls to respect the results of the 2020 elections and the state of emergency, release all arbitrarily detained persons, uphold human rights, and restore a democratic transition. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Liechtenstein. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United States.
Thank you, Special Envoy Bishop, for your insightful briefing. As you noted, the situation in Myanmar remains extremely concerning. Conflict between the military regime and opposition forces have destabilized the country and displaced over 3 million people. That includes Rohingya and other minorities who have been victims of repression and violence. The United States will make substantial contributions to support the needs of refugees from Myanmar. Of the $3.8 billion the United States will contribute to OCHA's pooled funds, $300 million will help meet needs in Bangladesh, and $140 million will help meet those in Myanmar. The crisis has also exacerbated transnational crime, including narcotics production, scam centers, and human trafficking, which threaten the safety and security of the United States and the world. We call for tangible measures, including a de-escalation of violence and the release of unjustly detained political prisoners, as steps towards genuine dialogue between all parties and affected groups. The United States remains committed to supporting path of peace and stability for the people of Myanmar. Thank you.
The States of America, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Switzerland. Thank you, Special Envoy, for your briefing and your commitment. Switzerland remains deeply concerned about the ongoing conflict, the worsening humanitarian situation, and the persistent violations of human rights and international humanitarian law committed by all parties. Attacks on civilian infrastructure, restrictions on humanitarian access, as well as arbitrary arrests and arbitrary detentions disproportionately affect ethnic and religious minorities, particularly the Rohingya. While we take note of recent measures that have led to the release of some detainees, much remains to be done. Switzerland reiterates its call for the immediate and unconditional release of all persons arbitrarily deprived of their liberty and for an end to practices that undermine fundamental freedoms. Confidence-building measures should help create an environment in which all people in Myanmar can participate meaningfully in their country's future. In this regard, Switzerland emphasizes the importance of an inclusive political process involving all stakeholders, including women, youth, and ethnic minorities. Any political process, including elections, must comply with international law, ease tensions, and contribute to a peaceful and lasting solution to the crisis. We're also concerned about the scale of humanitarian needs in the country. All parties must ensure rapid, safe, and unimpeded humanitarian access and respect their obligations under international humanitarian law. Switzerland reiterates that lasting peace also requires accountability. We reaffirm our support for international efforts in this regard, notably the work of the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar, and underscore the importance of ensuring justice for victims and survivors. Finally, we call on the international community to continue paying attention to the plight of the Rohingya and other minorities. Nearly a year after the high-level conference, follow-up efforts remain limited. Discussions must lead to concrete improvements for the affected communities, particularly through the meaningful participation of Rohingya representatives. We reaffirm the importance of dialogue and complementarity between the ASEAN Special Envoy for Myanmar and the United Nations Secretary-General's Special Envoy. Madam Special Envoy, I'd also like to put a question. How does your office intend to maintain the momentum of the high-level conference and promote an inclusive political process that addresses the concerns of all communities in Myanmar, including the Rohingya? Thank you. I thank the distinguished representative of Switzerland. I now give the floor to the Special Envoy to respond.
Thank you, Deputy President, and I also thank all participants, all distinguished delegates for their contributions today. I will take this opportunity to answer the questions that were put to me directly. And my answer to the question put by the Ambassador of the Philippines also goes to the question asked by the distinguished delegate from Switzerland, and then there was a further question from Norway. I think the key to making progress in this matter continues to be collaboration between the United Nations and ASEAN. ASEAN as the most significant regional organisation in the region, and the United Nations have an opportunity to make progress in this seemingly intractable position. And as Special Envoy, most certainly support ASEAN's centrality and the importance of working with the Special Envoys. I have worked closely, as I mentioned, with 3 ASEAN Special Envoys, and the collaboration has included a joint engagement with Myanmar stakeholders. In fact, we had a very successful joint discussion with women's groups who feel that their voices are not often heard, and also our joint briefings to the Security Council, and they have been, I think, timely and well received. I will continue my ongoing discussions with Foreign Minister Lazaro on strengthening cooperation, and I hope to visit the Special Envoy in Manila soon. I am also looking forward to working with Singapore in 2027. It's my belief that joint collaboration of ASEAN and the United Nations sends a very powerful message to all those who are continuing the conflict, and there is virtually universal support for the 5-point consensus plan, and that likewise sends a powerful message. So I intend to continue to work closely with the ASEAN Special Envoys. As far as the questions from the distinguished representative of Norway, there are areas of common interest, and virtually all nations recognise the following. Transnational crime must be addressed, and the impact of transnational crime is not just regional, it is global. The disproportionate impact of this conflict on women and children, that is virtually universally recognised, and there is virtually no dispute that the Rohingya minority and other minorities are refugees. They have fled Myanmar, and the burden of the refugee flows is being borne by others, most notably Bangladesh, and that is unsustainable. And also, virtually all member states refer to the humanitarian need and recognise the level of support that is needed. So these are areas where we have common cause, if you like. In terms of the momentum in relation to the Rohingya and the high-level conference, I should say that I have spoken to Rohingya groups recently, and I have committed to amplifying their voices continuously, because any durable solution must be led by their voices. And I'm hoping to return to Bangladesh soon. There's a new government in Bangladesh, and I'm hoping to do that as well. So I stand ready to work with all member states and any other entities, and most particularly ASEAN, for the betterment of the people of Myanmar. I thank you, Mr. President, and I thank the distinguished delegates for their